Well, it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Robert Hinde, who I've known for 20 or 30 years now, although we're in different disciplines. Robert, tell me where and when you were born.
I was born in 1923 in Norwich, England. My father was a GP who had married a nurse at Guy's Hospital soon after he trained, and I was the youngest of 4 children. So like everything else I'm going to tell you, I was very lucky right from the start.
And your mother was?
My mother was Isabella Taylor from a family in Westmoreland, Kirby Lonsdale. Her father had died early, and her mother had brought up, I think it was 6 children, by starting a cake shop in Kirby Lonsdale, and several of the girls had, I think very courageously at that time, fled the nest. One of them went out to Malay as a nurse, my mother went to Guy's, and another one became a school teacher in Mansfield.
I know Kirby Lonsdale well.
Yeah.
I did a study of its history once. It seems particularly appropriate to ask you about parent-child relationships, since much of your most famous work is in that field, in relation to both humans and monkeys. So, not too deeply, but what effects do you think the character of either your mother or your father had on your subsequent life?
My mother was a very loving mother, and I was the youngest child and got a great deal of her attention. And I think my security stems from having had a very good relationship with her. My father was an extremely hard-working, conscientious GP, but he had an intense interest in natural history and also in the ancient history of the Middle East, where he'd served in World War I. And I'm sure that his encouragement of my natural history interests was very important to me.
You mentioned your mother giving you a very loving, supporting background. Some of your early work was particularly about the fact that in monkey colonies, small monkeys are pushed out or encouraged to be independent by their parents. Do you think your interest in that came out at all of your relationship with your mother?
No.
You don't remember your mother trying to push you out of the nest? Okay, so where did you go to school?
I went to school at Oundrel, a boys' public school. I went at the age of 11, which was too young to go away. I hated it. And I made no real friends at Oundrel. I was labelled very early on as the professor because I wore glasses. That may have had a very interesting effect on me, I don't know.
Were you short-sighted?
No, my father, I think mistakenly, thought I had a squint when I was 2 years old, and they clapped me in glasses to try and correct it. I think it's probably a very antiquated procedure.
Because there have been studies of the effects of myopic children's wearing glasses on their personalities, which fit with your suggestion.
Have there? Oh.
Yes.
I won't ask you what it did to them.
Made them studious, yes. They didn't play games because they couldn't see the football.
Oh, well, that's another issue, yes.
Were you any good at games?
No, not really. I was in the second school 15 in the end. It was that level. Captain of house football. But I wasn't really very good. I used to play squash quite a lot or rather fives, I should say, squash when I got up to Cambridge.
You say you didn't really make many friends there, so there were no students. It's a bit odd that you went to Oundle as your first boarding school. You hadn't gone to a preparatory school that was a boarding school.
No. Oundle had a preparatory house, which was called the Berrystead, and I went there at 11 to 14.
I see. Were there any teachers at Oundle who particularly influenced you?
That was the thing I got out of Oundle, and I was entered for Schoolhouse because when they interviewed, or were interviewed, I'm not sure which way around it was, my parents found he had an acquaintance with Kirby Lonsdale, and so they wanted me to go into his house. But I was...
Who is he? What was it?
A man called Kenneth Fisher, who was a very good headmaster, I think. But when I got towards the end of my time in the Berrystead, I was the first boy to go into a school certificate science form called Shell, where the form master was a man called Ian Hebburn, to whom I owe an enormous debt.
That's Hepburn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And towards the end of my first, I remember, he was also known as Saki, and I remember for our first chemistry prep...
Is that with an R or as in the novelist Saki?
No, with an R. Our first chemistry prep, he told us to write down 5 metals and 5 non-metals, and I wrote down paper, string and coal or something as my non-metals, and I remember him reading these out in the class. You must remember I was much the youngest in the class, and from the Berrystead, which was a very low place, and paper and string and wood with a combination produced by one Hinde from the Berrystead, I believe. Absolutely putting down. But he was a wonderful, and he, at the end of that term, he called me out after chapel and said, well, Hinde, I think you better come to my house. And so he took me away from the headmaster's house, and he was a wonderful bachelor housemaster who did all sorts of things with the boys. He had music concerts on Sunday night, and he was a keen naturalist. He wrote a very good book on flowers of the coast for the New Naturalist series. He took boys rock climbing, and he used to take me out bird watching a lot to places around Oundle. So I owe him a very great debt. He wasn't the only master at Oundle I owed a lot to. I mean, the headmaster was a keen bird watcher, and he used to take me out in his car sometimes. And at the very end of my time at Oundle, the war was beginning, and his son, who was a man called James Fisher, a famous ornithologist who started the New Naturalist series, his wife came to teach, and she taught me English, and she played an enormously important part in my life, in making me, if I may say so, not just a scientist, by supplying me with books to read during the war and all that sort of thing.
What was the subject that Hepburn was meant to be teaching? I mean, was he chemistry or physics or?
Who?
Hepburn. Yeah.
Hepburn was a chemist.
A chemist.
Yes.
So did you do chemistry and physics and so on at A-level?
Yes, I wasn't allowed to do biology at school because that was the dung sixth for farmers, and it was felt that if I was going to be a scientist, I was absolutely no good at Latin, and I was thrown out of the classical side really, and chemistry, physics and maths.
And were there any other hobbies that you had apart from bird watching? I mean, were you interested in music or?
Not especially. I haven't got an ear at all. I used to go fishing, a certain amount. I collected butterflies. There was another master who was very good to me called Captain Collier, MC, who'd retired from the Indian Army and gave up shooting tigers in favour of collecting butterflies, I think. and he was quite an important influence on my life. So I got, from Oundle, I got a great deal of encouragement from the staff in natural history pursuits and in general, any sort of intellectual thing. I didn't make many friends amongst the boys. Oundle prided itself, and I'm sure I'm offending you, in taking boys from the industrial north.
You're not offending me, because we used to play rugby against you, and
Where were you then?
I was at Sedbergh.
Oh, were you? Yes.
And it was just the same. We were turning mill lads
Yes.
into young gentlemen and so on. So I went through the same thing a bit further north than you, so
Yes.
I know what it was like. Were you bullied at all, or?
Yes, I think I was a little, but not very badly.
So where did you finally came to Cambridge, but where did you apply to? Was Cambridge the only place?
I applied to Emmanuel College, and I took a scholarship there at the beginning of the war, and I did reasonably well on chemistry and physics, but failed on maths, so I didn't get a scholarship. But after I'd been in the Air Force for about 6 months, this is a dreadful story. It's the height of nepotism.
Okay. Do you want this expunged from the record?
No, it's all right. My headmaster, who'd been a bird watcher and became almost a friend, wrote to me and said, "I've arranged for you to have a close exhibition at St John's College." You will remember that close exhibitions in those days were limited to certain schools, and there was more or less in the headmaster's jurisdiction to arrange them. So, I think to my great misfortune, great good fortune, I went to St John's and not to Emmanuel. Emmanuel had been my father's college and my brother's college and various other things.
If you hadn't got this exhibition, would you have gone to Emmanuel?
Yes.
Yes. You'd been admitted but hadn't got an exhibition, was that?
Yes, I think so. I don't remember the details, to be quite honest.
Yeah. And you came up to read biology, or?
Well, I went into the war.
Oh, that's right.
In those days, at that time...
What year is this?
Must have been 40, I think.
Yeah.
You could sign on for aircrew at 17 and a quarter, which I did, and passed all the medicals and things, but they didn't call me up until the end of that year, which must have been 41. And so I stayed on at Oundle, and then I worked, had a lovely few months working for the Young Men's Christian Association, driving a van, taking tea round to the anti-aircraft sites and the aerodromes and places in Norfolk. And I also worked with James Fisher, my headmaster's son, who was doing rat research, trying to control rats in the Port of London, which became a crucially important issue in the war because of the food shortages. And while I was working with him, I remember going to the telephone in the London Zoo and being told that my brother was missing. My brother was the eldest in the family. He was a RAMC doctor and a troopship. His troopship was torpedoed. And my father was, my parents, I should say, didn't hear any news of him for about 3 or 4 months. They could get nothing out of the War Office. And eventually they found a letter in a Liverpool newspaper, or sent one, which said something about the survivors, and my father got in touch with one of them eventually, and learned that my brother had died a really horrible, slow death of wounds and exposure in an open boat in the Atlantic. And it's not only the nature of his death, but the effect it had on my parents, which was exacerbated a couple of years later when they heard that I was missing, and the Air Ministry refused to say that I was very happy and alive. But the effect of bereavement is something that isn't often talked about when people are talking about the effects of war. I should also have said that, while I'm talking about this, that in my childhood I lived next door to a family of which there was a boy a year older than me, a boy the same age as me, and a girl a bit younger than me, and we were very close indeed. And Graham, the one who was my immediate contemporary, he was actually 3 months older than me, also died in the war, shot down over the Ruhr in 1944, and it was that comes later in my life, really, doesn't it? So
but these are the seeds of your later interest in war.
Yeah.
Do you think the work with the YMCA was also seeds for your later interest in religion, or that's rather a frivolous
Not
question?
in the least, no. I was the only young man with 5 very beautiful women, and we used to have a lovely time. There's nothing at all to do with
Christianity.
So then, eventually I was called up and went out to what was then southern Rhodesia to train as a pilot. And they were getting enough pilots by then, and they got more people out there than they needed. And so I was hanging around in the initial training wing for a long time, in which we were tested on sums like, if 2 men dig a trench 20 feet long in 3 days, how long do 4 men take, etc., all that stuff, which was really very, very elementary and easy for me. And then I went on to flying training school and flew Tiger Moths, through service flying training school and Speed Oxfords, and then eventually, and then I was, a whole group of us was selected for Coastal Command, and I was sent down to George in South Africa to train as a navigator, because Coastal Command pilots were trained as both pilots and navigators. And then I came home on a troop ship via South America. It took weeks and weeks, in fact months and months, to get home. And I was on a fairly fast troop ship that didn't have an escort, and we had to watch for submarines. And I used to watch for submarines with another young man who trained as a bomb angler. And I was then a mild Christian, I'd say a skeptical Christian, and he was a passionate atheist. And we talked for weeks and weeks and weeks as we watched for submarines. And when we got to England, he was a Christian and I was an atheist. We sort of converted each other. And that was something that I then put on the back burner and came back to in my retirement.
Hmm. How was it, there must be further service because you go missing.
Yes, and eventually I joined a Catalina crew and was flying boats and was posted to a squadron operating in the Indian Ocean from what was then Ceylon, with an outstation in the southernmost of the Maldive Islands, and we were looking for the Japanese fleet and Japanese submarines. And it meant very long trips over the sea of 18 hours or so. Take off in the early morning, meet a convoy at daylight, stay with it all day and then fly home again, that sort of thing. Or simply searching for the Japanese fleet. It was not especially dangerous. I am glad to say that I was never involved in killing anybody, and I was never in contact with the enemy. we were simply looking for them. And all the casualties that Coastal Command, no, that's an exaggeration, but many of the casualties, the dangers, were either running out of fuel on these long trips, or weather, or while we were in England flying into a mountain in bad weather. They were those sorts of dangers rather than enemy action, except for one crew which did find the Japanese fleet and lasted just long enough to get off a radio message before the Zeros got them. Then I came back to England, trained as a Sunderland pilot, and then did a few operational trips, but the war was then over. And because I had an exhibition at St John's College, as I've told you, I spent a week's leave convincing the Air Ministry that a close exhibition was a very special form of scholarship and entitled me to an early release from the Air Force. And so I managed to get up to Cambridge in January '46, which was ahead of most of the...
You had missed a term, but you came in on the second term.
I came in the second term, and of course, as an ex-serviceman, I didn't have to keep the 9 terms.
Are there any, I mean, it's interesting how many of the people I've interviewed had that big break experience in the Second World War, including Sir Andrew Huxley, who I've been talking to about his work with Alan Hodgkin and so on. Are there any reflections you want to make about how that experience influenced your later work? I mean, presumably didn't influence your academic work so much as...
Well, I did a good deal of bird watching whenever I could. And in fact, the first academic lecture I gave was to the Oxford Bird Club on the birds of southern Rhodesia, which is a real dreadful, makes me cringe when I think of it. I did start to take an external London degree by correspondence and took the I took zoology and subsidiary chemistry, and I took the subsidiary chemistry and passed that, so that I only had the zoology to take, and I eventually did finish that off immediately after my Cambridge degree, and got a class lower at London than I got at Cambridge, because it was an extremely factual exam, the external degree, and I just didn't know the stuff.
So you had two undergraduate degrees?
Yes. I thought at that time I would get a couple of extra votes out of them, but they abolished the part of the university seats in Parliament.
At Cambridge you were reading biology?
In Cambridge I read natural sciences.
Natural sciences.
And it was initially physiology, chemistry and zoology. And then part 2 zoology. I got a 2-1 in my first year, and then the first in the 2 succeeding years. But I spent a great deal of my time on the Cambridge sewage farm, where it was a marvellous place for migrant birds. And I published a few papers on migrant waders and organised a watch at different sewage farms all over the country, so that we could see whether the waders came through on a broad front or in a narrow stream, and relate the arrival of the waders to warm temperatures in Corunna, and that sort of thing. And during that time, I was fortunate in coming across a bird on the Cambridge sewage farm which had never bred in Britain before. At least, so I believe, and so did James Fisher and all the famous ornithologists in Britain who flocked to see it, believe. And that was the moustached warbler. the record was accepted by the British Ornithologist Union Records Committee and has been until last year, when it was questioned by some new upstart and has now been taken off the British record list. But anyway, it was very important to me because it got me my first job. I would also say that while we're talking about Cambridge, I did make a number of friends amongst the ex-servicemen, and one of the extraordinary things about it was, which I've only realised on reflection, and really only when one of them, a man with whom I shared a room, died at his memorial service, that we never talked to each other about our war experiences. Never. There was a man, the man with whom I shared a room had shot down 3 Junkers 88s in 50 minutes and was a DFC and an Air Force Cross. He got an Air Force Cross after the war for trying to fly British aircraft through the sound barrier, and he used to go up to 40,000 feet and go into a steep dive and see what happened, and only one aircraft came to pieces, but he never talked about it. There was another chap who had no legs, and I have a very vivid memory of we were all going to the pub together and he couldn't quite keep up. Come on, peg leg. And it was a sort of joke that he hadn't got any legs. But I never knew how he lost them. And that's something I've reflected a lot about more recently, actually.
It's obviously clearly a conscious, you're all aware that you've all been in the war and you consciously avoid the subject.
Yes, and the interesting thing is why. And it was partly not wanting to shoot a line, I think. Partly guilt of being a survivor, and in some cases guilt at having killed. But that was Cambridge.
Well, on Cambridge at that time, who were your teachers, and did any of them influence you a lot?
I think it's all right for this to go on the record.
Good.
I had 2 supervisors in St John's in zoology. Frank Hollick, who was very shy, and he used to sit on the edge of his chair in his room, and I used to sit on the edge of the chair in his room, and neither of us would say a word for what seemed like 10 minutes at a time. He was very interested in the aesthetics of animals, but not a very good teacher. And the other one was a man called Colin Bertram, also now dead, who had been in charge of fish cultivation on Cyprus during the war to feed the troops with carp. And about that time became secretary of the British Genetical Society or something, and was always talking about people being good breeding stock.
Something from late Victorian Galtonian genetics.
Yes, exactly. Social Darwinism.
There were no inspiring teachers you had in other subjects, or?
I don't think there were, quite honestly. There was a lovely man, Palmer, who taught me chemistry, who was incredibly old. He had white hair anyway. And, I remember when he interviewed me, just when I came up before I started, and I was in Air Force uniform, and he kept on saying, well, Hinde, I should rather do that, otherwise you'll find you've had it, and using little bits of Air Force slang to make me feel at home. He was a really lovely man. But
who was the master of St John's at that time? Do you remember?
A man called Benions, who was a classicist, and that was when I was an undergraduate.
Jack wasn't there then, was he? Jack Goody?
Yes, he was, but we didn't really know each other early on.
So at the end of your undergraduate degree, you got a first, and then what did you do then?
And then David Lack,
Oh yes, the famous Lack.
who was the ornithologist, had been to see the so-called moustache warbler, and he offered me a job as a research assistant in Oxford. And it was a research assistant that would allow me to do a DPhil, and he wanted me to do a comparative study of the feeding behaviour of rooks and jackdaws. And that struck me as incredibly boring. It was in relation to Gauss's hypothesis, which is very popular at the time, which said that no two species with the same ecology can exist together at the same time. And rooks and jackdaws appear to feed together, but so in some way they must not be competing. David was at that time moving from studying robins to studying great tits, the ecology of the great tit. And he said, well, why don't you do a behaviour study of the great tit? And so that's what I did. And it was a lovely time. Worked in a wood, Whiteham Wood, just outside.
Oh, yes, I know
Oxford.
Whiteham.
It's full of primroses, blackberries, sweet chestnuts.
Magical place, yes.
Magical place. And I used to just wander around with a notebook, a pair of field glasses, and write down what I saw. And it was just wonderful. It so happens that now my daughter, who's a research fellow at Newman now, is also studying great tits. But she has incredibly complicated apparatus and cameras in the nest box, loudspeakers, microphones. But what's been nice for me is that I've been able to work as her unpaid research assistant and go around the nest boxes and see whether there are any eggs in them in the early morning. That's another story.
Was David Lack a good supervisor?
No, he was not a good supervisor. He corrected the English in my papers. He wasn't especially, although he'd worked on behaviour of the robin, he wasn't especially interested in what I was doing. But I said I've been lucky all the way through. I was lucky to get into Coastal Command because I survived, and most people who went on, a high proportion of people who went into Bomber Command didn't. And I was lucky in Oxford because Nico Tinbergen came to Oxford when I was a DPhil student, had no students of his own, and so I had his undivided attention for a while, and he was the person who really influenced me in my subsequent work.
A very famous figure.
Yes.
Was he? Is there anything you want to say about him? I mean, he was.
Well, there are biographies of him, and it's no good my repeating it. But he was a very charismatic man who did everything himself. He never would put things on to his students or anything. But he made his students who were keeping sticklebacks go out and catch their own daphnia to feed the sticklebacks on, for instance. I mean, he was all for doing things all the way through. And we spent a long time talking, and he was a great help to me.
Is it a coincidence? It's only a sample of two people, but Tinbergen and Lorenz are both sort of mid-European Viennese kind of names. This isn't part of the great surge of people from Middle Europe to Cambridge and Oxford during the war or after the war, is it?
No, I mean, far from it. Lorenz was an Austrian, actually, and joined the Nazi Party, and did some very interesting work in the 1930s, and in a sense got ethology going. Tinbergen was working independently in Holland, and got into contact with Lorenz shortly before the war. Lorenz was taken prisoner of war by the Russians, and treated reasonably well, I think. Tinbergen was taken into a hostage camp by the Germans, where they took all the professors from Leiden, I think, and they took them out and shot one or two when the resistance did anything. So he had a rough time during the war. And I was the first conference where they met. It was very interesting after the war, and they both tried to have a good relationship with each other. But Nico said to me the thing he couldn't bear was hearing German voices in the corridor outside his bedroom. That again is another story, sorry. But
that's a nice story. I mean, it's an interesting story.
They, although they were both passionately interested in animal behaviour, Lawrence was an ideas man, Tinbergen was an experimenter, and there were two ethologies, Lawrencean ethology and Tinbergen ethology, and I was very much influenced by Nico. Conrad was always very kind to me until I wrote a paper criticising his model. And then he used to talk about Nico and me as these English-speaking ethologists, as though we were a separate race. Oxford, DPhil.
Yes.
Yeah. I was newly married, and so didn't have much time for college life,
Yes.
though I was a member of Balliol.
Was this the time? Who was Master of Balliol? Was it
Ramsey?
Ramsey or?
I haven't the faintest idea, I'm afraid. I didn't ever come. Well, I suppose I must have come across him at some stage.
Clay or someone? Yeah.
And I did a DPhil in effectively 18 months. I was allowed to do it in 2 years, and it was so different then because, I mean, my DPhil was typed, not even bound properly, and very crude. And then, another piece of luck, Bill Thorpe of Jesus College here was wanting to start an ornithological field station to study the relation between instinct and learning. And he asked Lawrence to come and be the curator, and Lawrence had got another job. And then he asked a man called Reg Moreau to do it, and he turned it down in the end. And so he asked me, and that was my great piece of luck. And I came in 1950 to Madingley, in January 1950, I think, and where I worked until I retired, really, from that sort of work. And it gradually, well, we spent the first year putting up a perimeter fence and putting up aviaries, and I learned how to creosote aviaries and clearcoat wood and wire things together and all that sort of thing, which was fun actually. We had no building except for a small Nissen hut which had been left over by the Home Guard, and which we used as a food store. The university had just bought the whole of the Madingley estate, and that's why Bill was able to establish it there. And then I did some more work on great tits and on the comparative courtship behaviour of finches and various other odds and ends for the first few years. And I did a little work on imprinting. And I did quite a lot of work on... Bill had been interested in how birds learnt or to build nests, or whether they did so instinctively. And so...
What did he decide? Because I was looking at a thrush's nest today, I was thinking, how, by natural selection, could a bird have learnt? I mean, what gene controls that nest building? I mean, it must have watched some other bird doing it.
You should know well enough as an academic, we didn't decide anything. it's a very interesting problem which is still not fully solved.
Yeah.
What one can show is that birds with no experience will build nests, but how much they learn in the course of building is a very interesting topic. And I got slightly diverted into studying the endocrinological basis of nest building because I wanted to have canaries that would breed all the year round. And that actually turned out in quite an interesting way, because we could show the interaction between the changes in the external world, like daylight, the endocrine changes in the bird, the changes in the behaviour of the bird which produced new stimuli to which it responded, which produced new endocrine changes in the bird, and that sort of thing. And I was working at the same time as somebody called Danny Lehrman, who was an important influence on comparative psychology and ethology, was working in Rutgers in the States. And he became one of my closest friends. He was a very overweight New York Jew, very clever, very bright, very verbal. And his work on that topic has been carried on in the Institute of Animal Behaviour in Rutgers to this day, and has been very productive indeed. At that time we used to see each other about once a year, one side or the other of the Atlantic. And I remember arriving in Idlewild, as Kennedy was then called, at 5 o'clock in the morning, being met by Danny, and he said, "Come on, Robert, we're going bird watching." And by 10 o'clock in the morning we'd seen 51 species of American bird.
Was that where Lionel Tiger was?
I believe he did go to Rutgers, yes. I'm sorry, I'm not being a very good interviewer because I easily get diverted.
No, it adds to the charm of it. You don't really get diverted, it's moving along. But there's a point where you move from birds to primates.
I want to say one more thing about birds. The other thing I was extremely fortunate about was it was so easy to get money then. And I had one grant application turned down on the grounds that I hadn't asked for enough money. Could I use twice as much? To which I said yes. But I want to tell you this story. I got in contact with, or I think he got in contact with me, a colonel in the United States Air Force who was based in Brussels. And he came to see the work that I was doing with canaries. And I took him into hall, and we had some wine in the hall. And then I took him back to my room, and he drank scotch. And at 1 o'clock in the morning he said, "Well, we'll write your grant application." And he succeeded to write my grant application for me to the American Air Force. And it was called Nest Building Skills in Canaries. The skills what you fly a bomber with. And he insisted that I should say that I'd been a pilot, so that I should know the relevance of this. And they supported me in the system for 3 years. And then he came back, and the whole procedure went through again. And at 1 o'clock in the morning he said, "Well, now we'll write your renewal." And this time it was called sensory deprivation in canaries, because it was getting into the space age, and everybody was interested in sensory deprivation. And sometimes I used to take the nest material away from the den, so that made it okay. I met him years later, and he said his aim in life, he was really a cardiac physiologist, his aim in life had been to see what he could put across the generals in Washington. And I was his second best. The best had been a study of Indian fakirs on the grounds that they would help American airmen to survive if they came down in the sea. Mine was the second best, so I was very proud of that.
Perhaps he was the person who sponsored that famous project which I heard about, the irrelevant behaviour of the Barbary dove. This was cited as, the acme of useless.
Yeah, but that was Senator Proxmire.
Was it?
Who was a senator who tried to stop any payment for pure research.
That's right.
By purporting that it was really useless.
Yes, that's right. It was a famous test case of
Yeah.
how irrelevant could it be. So, shall we move on to?
Yeah, monkeys. Well, I want to say one other thing. During this time, I was existing for several years without a proper job from year to year. Then, as I was made a senior assistant in research, and eventually an assistant director of research, but I never had a proper lectureship. And the best thing that ever happened to me in my life was that I applied for a demonstratorship in psychology and didn't get it.
You'll have to explain why it was so good that you didn't get it. You might have gone into a terrible career, or...
Well, because I would not have done the research I was able to do. I'd have had to do a lot of teaching, and I was much freer to do research, and freer to do research of the sort that I wanted to do. I mentioned earlier that I did a certain amount of work on imprinting, that's parent-offspring relationship in birds. And this came to the ears of a man called John Bowlby, who was a London
very famous John Bowlby,
psychoanalyst.
Yeah.
And at that time he was very concerned with the fact that parents were not allowed to visit their children in hospital, or at any rate visiting hours were restricted often to half an hour a week. I think my voice is going to go soon.
We'll have a break in a minute. Do you want to have a break now, or you're right?
No, it's all right. Restricted to half an hour a week, and he felt this was a very bad thing for personality development in the children, because pre-war he'd worked a lot with adolescents who'd got into trouble, and found that nearly all of them had had a separation experience from their parents in youth. And this was only clinical evidence, and he wanted experimental evidence to try and confirm his thesis. And I used to go down to seminars at the Tavistock Clinic in London, which was then in Beaumont Street. We used to meet in a tiny basement room with a dirty, dusty window opening up onto the pavement, pavement above it. And it was a most wonderful seminar that he used to run, where there was a Freudian analyst, a Kleinian analyst, a Hullian learning theorist, a Skinnerian learning theorist, a Piagetian, an anti-psychiatrist, Ronnie Lang, used to come along sometimes, myself as an animal chap, and one or two psychiatric social workers. And what was
Melanie Klein, was she around? Was Melanie Klein of that generation, or?
John Bowlby was a Kleinian.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
The wonderful thing about it was that we had nothing theoretically in common, but a common interest in parent-offspring relationships. And that taught me such an important lesson, that the important thing is not the theory, but the problem, and to go for the problem and not to try and prove or disprove theories all the time. After I'd been going to the seminar for a year or two, John helped me get money to set up a rhesus monkey colony in Cambridge, which we did with the help of the Rockefeller and Mental Health Research Fund and various other things. And we had 6 groups of rhesus monkeys, each with a male, 3 or 4 females, and they're young. And we spent a lot of time working out methods of recording behaviour, which in itself was worthwhile because those comparable methods were much used in the field by primatologists subsequently, and were able to show in the end that a 10-day separation could produce effects that we could pick up 10 days later. 10-day separation could pick up effects that we could pick up 2 years later in their inability to cope with stressful situations. And that took about 10 years, and we were able to contrast what happens with situations comparable to mother goes to hospital, infant stays at home, infant goes to hospital, mother stays at home, both go to hospital together, both go to different hospitals, you see what I mean? And what was interesting was that the symptoms were exactly the same in monkeys as they are in school children, in young children, but the details differed because of the different social structure of monkeys. I won't bother you with the details, but it made me realise both the value of comparative studies and their great danger.
I can see the value. What is the great danger?
Well, I have to explain that, roughly speaking, it was this, that in humans, the child is less effective if the mother goes to hospital and he stays at home in the familiar environment. Whereas in the monkeys it was the other way round. And the reason it was the other way round was because if the mother had been to hospital, when she came back, she had to re-establish her relationships with all the other group members and didn't have any time for this demanding infant. So it was that social factor that made a difference. And you've got to look at the whole situation to see whether the results are transferable or not. But anyway, it did help John to get the hospital regulations changed.
It was a very famous shift, I remember. I was married to a psychiatric social worker at that time.
Oh, yes.
My first wife, and she was brought up on Bowlby and people. And you remained a friend and colleague of John's?
He remained a friend and colleague, and my second wife works in attachment theory still. And attachment theory has become probably the most influential theory in child development now.
Have you looked at all at the sort of wider comparative ways of bringing up children in different cultures? The sort of
No, but it's a very, I mean, Mary Ainsworth, who was a colleague of John Bowlby's, had worked with the Buganda in Uganda, and her emphasis was on the similarities, of course, and the importance of contact comfort and that sort of thing. There's been a lot of comparative work done, but I haven't been involved in it.
Erickson and people, because, for example, comparing the English, who I've written about and have a tension because of their individualistic market capitalist social structure, they immediately from birth, parents are giving signals to the children that they've got to learn to stand on their own 2 feet and be separated, because the nuclear family system will mean that in their teens they will be leaving, as compared to the Japanese, for instance, who, as you know, they sleep with their children and they keep them very, very tightly bound together.
And the mother holds the baby looking at her and playing with her hair, whereas American mothers, they're looking outwards.
That's right. Even down to wonderful details which I've had explained to me, that when a Japanese feeds a baby, she gets down to the same eye level as the baby, and if the baby picks up a spoon and can't really use it very well, the mother will not take it away and feed the baby, but will guide the hand to help it, as if, I am helping you do these things. Whereas the English and French mothers will say, it's feeding time, I better do this, and spoon it in. So all sorts of differences.
Very wonderful things happened for me during that time. One was that I got a letter from the President of the Royal Society saying, you will have heard that we have established these Royal Society research professorships. Would you like one? Well, I hadn't heard, but I said yes, I would like one. So that was lovely, and it just has given me an opportunity to follow my research interests wherever they led me.
What year was this?
I think it was 1963, and
do you know how that happened? It's a dream
no,
come
but
true.
I strongly suspect Nico Tinbergen and Thorpe. I mean, neither of them would ever say anything to me.
Nico Tinbergen and
Bill Thorpe,
oh
who
yes, yeah.
started the Madingly thing.
Oh yes, yeah.
I was his 2IC really. And I think I've strayed a bit apart from the Royal Society, but it's been, I think it's been wonderful for me anyway. Whether I've been doing what they would want me to do, I don't know. The other wonderful thing that happened was that Louis Leakey was looking, had come to the conclusion that the secret of man's origins lay with the great apes, and that women were better at studying animals than men. And he'd found this girl called Jane Goodall, and he wanted her to get a PhD, and he wanted someone to supervise her. And since Professor Hall at Bristol was the only other person working with monkeys, and he died through a monkey bite, so I was the only person in Britain who knew anything about non-human primates. I knew nothing about chimpanzees, but it gave me an opportunity to supervise her, and later to supervise Diane Fossey on gorilla, and to spend time at their camps, getting all the excitement and pleasure out of research on chimps and gorillas without having to do any of the hard work, and subsequently of supervising many students who worked on their camps. So that was a very good time for me. It was a very good break. And although I never did any field work on non-human primates, I've had an enormous number of children,
Freudian slip.
Very Freudian slip.
Yes.
Enormous number of students, some of whom have become very distinguished, who were working on at those two sites, mostly at those two sites, but also some working on elephants and other African animals. Quite an experience to supervise Jane Goodall.
I was going to ask what she was like, yes.
Well, in an essay about her life, she said that after supervisions with me, she used to go back to her digs and weep and throw all her books into a corner. Which I think is a bit unfair on me, actually, because neither she nor Diane Fossey really liked writing academic stuff. And she taught me an enormous lot, both of them did, principally that animals were individuals and not just members of a species. And my orientation had always been up to that point of thinking of them as members of a species. And she taught me that they were all individuals. Jane often claims that she made me give our monkeys names, but that's not true. We were giving her our monkeys names long before I knew her, but that was more as a matter of convenience and not as a matter of personality differences in the monkeys.